Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome aboard at the Helm. Today, we're going to work from island to instrument, from story to sea warfare, and then back again to the kind of practical wisdom we try to build here every Thursday. We'll begin with our island countdown and spend a little more time with our last island, Nevis, before pointing the bow towards St. Bart's, our new target island at number 20. Then we'll take one short nautical term, bumpkin, which is a small piece of gear with a surprisingly good lesson. And our feature story today is the long development and saga of the torpedo, how it changed naval warfare, how the Japanese became the world leaders in torpedo capability for many years, and how the British responded with a wonderfully odd but important invention called the Foxer. Then we will look at some of the lighter aspects of At the Helm and share some reflections, and then give a brief introduction to the Hornblower series and a note on John Caldwell, the author of Desperate Voyage, a book that I just finished yesterday. So let's get underway. Number 1, Island Countdown, a final look at Nevis. Before we sail on to St. Bart's, I want to give Nevis a proper final look. Nevis is one of those islands that does not need to shout. It has a quiet confidence. It is volcanic, green, deeply historical, and intimate in scale. It is not trying to be the flashiest island in the Caribbean. It has a slower dignity. For our Nautical Me purposes, that makes it a wonderful island of reflection. Nevis asks a different kind of question than St. Bart's. St. Bart's says, "Where are you going when you are ready to be seen?" Nevis says, "Where do you go to remember who you are?" That is why I like having Nevis in our countdown. It gives us balance. And the Caribbean is not one story, it is many stories layered on top of each other. Indigenous history, European competition, sugar, slavery, trade, hurricanes, harbors, privateers, plantations, pirates, churches, forts, and modern tourism. Every island carries a different version of that history. Nevis also gives us the wonderful connection to Alexander Hamilton, who was born there, and that gives the island a larger historical echo, a small island producing a figure who would later help shape the financial and constitutional life of a new nation. So Nevis is a reminder that small places can have large consequences. For us, Nevis becomes a pause island. It is the place in the countdown where we ask, what have we already learned? What have we carried forward? What do we want to leave behind before the next island? That is a very useful part of any voyage because not every island is a finish line. Some are places to reprovision, repair, think, and reset. So before we move on, let's give Nevis its due. Nevis is our island of memory, reset, and quiet strength. Now we turn to St. Bart's, our new target island at number 20. St. Bart's has a very different feel. Where Nevis is reflective and historical, St. Bart's is polished, stylish, and high energy in a refined way. It has that French Caribbean character, beautiful beaches, a lively harbor culture, and a reputation for sailing, luxury, and careful presentation. But I don't want to treat St. Bart's as just a fancy island postcard, because for At the Helm, St. Bart's becomes a capability island. It represents the point where preparation begins to show. You don't just drift into St. Bart's in the symbolic sense. You arrive there with some polish, some confidence, and some ability to handle yourself, especially after the terrifying airplane landing on a scary small runway. So in our countdown, St. Bart asks, are you becoming more seaworthy? Are you more comfortable around nautical language? Are you becoming to think like a person at the helm? Are you moving from observer to participant? That is the real target, not just the island, the version of yourself that can arrive there. And now for our first nautical term, which is bumpkin, B-U-M-K-I-N. A bumpkin, sometimes spelled boomkin, is a short spar that projects from a vessel. Depending on the vessel and the rig, it may help support or lead lines and rigging. Now, the reason I like this term, which I found in Desperate Voyage, the book I just finished, it's not because everyone needs to run out and inspect a bumpkin today. I like it because it is humble. A bumpkin is not the grand sail. It's not the wheel, the captain, nor the figurehead. It is a small structural helper. It sticks out, carries a load, and quietly helps the rig do what it is supposed to do. That gives us a simple at the helm lesson. Small fittings carry big loads. In boats, little things matter, right? A cleat, a shackle, a pin, a knot, a short spar, a line led correctly instead of carelessly. And in life, it is much the same. The small habit, the checklist, the trusted friend, the morning routine, the notebook, the calendar reminder, these may not look impressive, but they often carry more load than we care to admit. So today, bumpkin is a reminder that seamanship is not always dramatic. Sometimes seamanship is noticing the small thing before it fails. And now on to our feature story, which looks at the torpedo and the evolution from crude weapon to strategic shock. This is a terrific nautical subject because the torpedo changed naval thinking. Before the modern torpedo, the logic of sea power was fairly straightforward. Big ships carried big guns. Big guns threatened other big ships. Armor, range, and gunnery mattered enormously. But the torpedo introduced a different and deeply unsettling idea. A smaller, much cheaper vessel could threaten a much larger vessel by striking below the waterline. That changed the psychology of naval warfare. A battleship could no longer think only about another battleship. It had to worry about small torpedo boats, destroyers, submarines, aircraft, and later motor torpedo boats. The torpedo was not just a weapon, it was a system disturbance because it forced navies to change formations, tactics, ship design, escort methods, harbor defenses, and even night fighting doctrine. That is why this story belongs in At the Helm. It teaches us that one invention can change the rules of the sea. So, as we dive a little deeper, let's look at stage one. Early torpedoes were not what we think they were. Because originally the word torpedo often referred to what we would now call a naval mine or explosive charge. These early weapons were not sleek underwater missiles. They were often fixed explosives, floating charges, or devices placed near or against a ship's hull. The principle was simple. Put explosive force against the vulnerable underwater body of the ship, and that idea was both dangerous and powerful. A ship's armor might protect its sides above the waterline, but below the waterline, a hole could be catastrophic. This is the first important lesson. The torpedo attacked the hidden vulnerability, and that's the hull. That is why it mattered. Stage 2, we move from the early form of water-based mines to the spar torpedo. Picture a small boat carrying a long pole or spar with an explosive charge at the end. The attacking craft had to approach the target and place or thrust the explosive against the hull. That took nerve. It also took a terrifying willingness to close the distance. The spar torpedo was bold but dangerous to the attacker. It was the kind of invention that proves the concept before the method is fully mature. The operating idea was good. The delivery method was crude. That happens often in technology. The first working version of something is not always elegant. It is simply proof that a new kind of problem is now possible. And now, digging a little deeper into stage 3, which brings us to the self-propelled torpedo. And that's the next great leap. Now, the weapon itself could travel through the water towards the target, and that changed everything. The attacker did not have to carry the explosive all the way to the enemy ship. It could launch from a distance. This created new tactical questions. How far could it run? How fast could it travel? Would it hold depth? Would it run straight? Would it explode when it hit? Could the target see it coming? Could the firing ship escape after launch? This is where the torpedo becomes more than an explosive. It becomes a machine spanning propulsion, steering, depth control, warhead design, and launch doctrine, and they all had to work together because a torpedo that runs too deep is useless, while a torpedo that runs in circles becomes dangerous to its own side. A torpedo that fails to detonate is worse than embarrassing. It is operationally disastrous. So the torpedo became a test of engineering discipline. And that moves us into stage 4, where we get into submarines and torpedoes. Because once submarines became practical weapons of war, the torpedo became their natural partner. A submarine with a torpedo is a different kind of threat. It hides, it stalks, it waits. It changes the emotional condition of the sea. Surface warfare had always involved visibility, flags, smokes, guns, formations, range finders, and fleets in view. Submarine warfare made the danger invisible. Again, submarine warfare made the danger invisible. That required a new kind of defensive thinking. Convoys, escorts, hydrophones, sonar, depth charges, zigzag courses, blackout discipline, and anti-submarine patrols. Again, the weapon changed the whole system, and that is a recurring at the helm lesson. A serious new threat never arrives alone. It brings a new operating model with it. And that points directly to our second nautical term, which is an inside feature of this story about torpedoes. And that is today's second term called the Foxer, Foxer. A Foxer was a British acoustic decoy used during World War II. It was towed behind a ship to create noise in the water and attract acoustic homing torpedoes away from the vessel. Now, that is a wonderful thing to picture. You have a ship under threat from a torpedo that is listening for noise. So what do? You tow something noisy behind the ship. You give the torpedo another sound to chase. That is the Foxer. It is not glamorous. It is not elegant in the way a battleship is elegant. It is certainly not a heroic broadside or a grand maneuver. It's just a practical, noisy, and clever result. And it tells us something important about defense. Sometimes the goal is not to destroy the threat. Sometimes the goal is to misdirect it. That is very nautical and frankly very human. There are times when trouble is coming and the smartest response is not to absorb the hit. It is to create disturbance, confusion, and a better target somewhere else. The Foxer is a lesson in steering danger away. The next era of the torpedo brings us to the Japanese torpedo advantage. Now we come to the part of the torpedo story where the Japanese were, for many years, ahead of the field. During the years leading into the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Navy took torpedoes very seriously. They did not treat them as a side weapon. They built tactics around them. They trained for night attacks. They developed long-range doctrine. They understood that a torpedo could decide a battle before gunfire fully developed. The most famous example was the Type 93 torpedo, later nicknamed the Long Lance. Again, the famous example was the Type 93 torpedo, later nicknamed the Long Lance. It is one of the most feared naval weapons of World War II. It was large, it was fast, it had very long range, it carried a heavy warhead, and because of its oxygen propulsion system, it was harder to detect than many torpedoes that left more visible wakes. This was not just a better torpedo, it was a better torpedo inside a serious warfare doctrine. And that distinction matters. A good weapon without doctrine is potential. A good weapon with doctrine becomes a system. Japanese destroyers and cruisers could launch torpedoes at ranges Allied commanders often did not expect. In night actions especially, this created deadly surprise. That is one reason early Pacific naval battles were so punishing. Allied officers sometimes misread the threat. They underestimated the range, speed, and power of the Japanese torpedoes. Their mental model of torpedo danger was behind reality. And that is the larger lesson. The most dangerous enemy is not always the one with the largest ship. Sometimes it is the one who has quietly mastered a specific capability you have underestimated. So as we look at this story about the torpedo, it's almost like a consulting lesson. So let's step back. The torpedo is a weapon, yes, but for at the helm, it's also a bit of a consulting lesson because the torpedo teaches us about hidden risk. It teaches us that a small actor can threaten a larger one if they understand the weak point. It teaches us that invention changes doctrine. It also teaches us that countermeasures matter. It teaches us that outdated assumptions can be fatal. And with the Foxer, it teaches us that sometimes survival depends on drawing danger away rather than trying to meet it head on. So the working lesson for today is this: do not measure strength only by size. Measure it by aim, timing, discipline, and the ability to exploit or protect the hidden vulnerability. That is true at sea, it is true in organizations, and it's true in life. So now let's make today's At the Helm challenges a little lighter. These are not homework assignments. Think of them as small reflections from the chart table. And I've got 3 of them for you. The first one is your reflection on Nevis. Where in your life do you need a Nevis moment? A pause, a reset, a quiet harbor, a place to remember what matters before sailing on. Complete this phrase. My Nevis moment right now is, and fill in the blank. Reflection number 2, your St. Bart's target. What is one place, goal, skill, or state of confidence that feels like your St. Bart's? Not because it is fancy, because it means you have arrived with more polish, readiness, and self-command. Complete this phrase. My St. Bart's target is. Now for reflection 3, your bumpkin. What small thing is carrying more load than people realize? A habit, a person, a tool, a morning routine, a quiet act of discipline. Complete this phrase. My bumpkin is. And now another reflection. Your foxer. What distraction, decoy, or buffer could help steer trouble away from your main vessel? Maybe it is not answering every provocation. Maybe it is putting space between you and a problem. Maybe it is using a filter, rule, boundary, or delay. Complete this phrase. My foxer is. And this one may be the best of the day because not every threat deserves your hull. Now, one of my passion topics, introducing Hornblower series to you. And I want to introduce you to the one major sea story that beginners should start with. And that's the Horatio Hornblower series. Hornblower is the great fictional Royal Naval officer created by C.S. Forester. The Hornblower novels follow him through the Age of Sail and the Napoleonic Wars. But what makes Hornblower special is not just the action, it is the mind of command. Because Hornblower doubts himself. He calculates, he worries, he thinks ahead. He understands that a captain's decision is not merely personal, it infects the entire ship, the crew, the mission, and sometimes even the nation. That is why I want Hornblower in our At the Helm library, which you can find in our classroom section of our community. He represents quiet command, not noisy leadership, certainly not swagger, and not I know everything. He represents quiet command, the ability to think clearly while pressure builds. That is what we want to study because in boating, business, community, and life, the helm is not always held by the loudest person. Often it is held by the best person who can keep a cool mind while others are reacting. And when I think back of my memories of the Hornblower series, they're really fun to start off with and read them in the order in which they were intended to be read, because it goes through his naval upbringing, if you will, and he also gets into a lot of different difficult situations that are exciting and fun. And I was even able to find the book of charts for the Horatio Hornblower series in an antique bookstore. So if you're looking around and see that, grab it, because not too many of those around. Now, let's turn to one of our last topics, which is talking a little bit more about John Caldwell and his book that he authored called Desperate Voyage, which again, I just finished yesterday. And I want to keep John and Desperate Voyage in our conversation because Caldwell's story is very different from Hornblower's. Hornblower is trained command, while Caldwell represents desperate improvisation. After the war, John Caldwell wanted to reunite with his wife in Australia, and he set out from the Panama Canal across the Pacific in a very small boat with very limited experience. That is why the book has such force. It is not a polished manual, it is a survival education. Caldwell reminds us that the sea teaches directly. The sea does not care whether you meant well. It does not care whether you are inspired. It doesn't care whether your plans sounded good on land. It asks, can you repair? Can you ration? Can you steer? Can you endure? And can you learn fast enough? That is why Desperate Voyage belongs beside Hornblower. Hornblower teaches command under structure. Caldwell teaches endurance under pressure, and both matter. So today we moved from Nevis, our island of memory and reset, towards St. Bart's, our island of polish, readiness, and arrival. We learned the humble little term bumpkin and its lesson that small things carry big loads. We explored the torpedo, from crude underwater explosives to self-propelled weapons, submarines, countermeasures, and the Japanese long lance. We introduced the British Foxer, a noisy towed decoy designed to pull acoustic torpedoes away from the ship. And we began placing two major sea story anchors on our shelf: Hornblower for quiet command, and John Caldwell, Desperate Voyage for desperate endurance. So here's my final thought. A good sailor does not only learn how to move forward, a good sailor learns when to pause, what to protect, what to strengthen, and how to steer danger away. And that's a pretty good way to live, too. Until next time, I'm Phil Wilson, and this has been At the Helm. Keep one eye on the horizon, one hand near the helm, and enough wisdom aboard to know when the small things are carrying the big loads. We'll see you next week.